Hello and welcome to Axial Systems Talk IT Security webinar. This webinar is titled Connected Security, Your Best Defense Against Advanced Threats. It's one of a series of monthly webinars looking at key IT security topics with the help of specialists from global IT security leader Intel Security. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us via the email address or phone numbers on the screen now, or you can find us at www.axial.co.uk. If you don't already know us, we were launched over 26 years ago and we're an award-winning provider of innovative network, security and services solutions. We serve a wide range of customers including blue-chip financial institutions, telcos, legal firms, public sector and more. We have an extensive and focused technical team which enables us to tailor our best-of-breed technologies to meet individual customer requirements and gives us the capability to provide exceptional pre- and post-sales support. We have the highest level of accreditations and certifications across all of our technologies and are seen as a trusted advisor to our customers. So that's a quick thumbnail sketch of Axial. There's more information on our website at www.axial.co.uk, so please feel free to visit. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to this month's Intel Security Specialist who will present the webinar.
Welcome to this update from Intel Security around the explosion that we've seen in ransomware, and in particular the worrying acceleration of the use of cryptology and what we call cryptomalware. So I'm Mark Watkinson, and later on I'll be followed by Marcus Vertel. I will give you an update of what we're seeing, some of the statistics, some of the concerns, and some real-world examples of stuff that we've been dealing with over the past 6 months, and especially. And then Marcus will go through exactly the way that this crypto malware operates, and some of the handy tips and tricks, and some of the kind of combinations of technology that we're employing to better protect you against this worrying trend. So without much further ado, we'll dive right in. So our interest was spiked because throughout 2013 and the first half of 2014, we've seen a slow decline in ransomware as samples. But with the beginning of Q3 2014, we saw that it started to grow again. So we took a particular interest in what was happening here. Our interest was really pricked when we saw in Q4 the number of new samples, and this is new unique samples that we counted, rose by 155%, and the total individual unique malware samples that we saw in our labs broke the 2 million sample barrier. So we started to track this more in depth and really look at what was happening here, what are the trends, and what kind of samples are we seeing. And 3 months later, in January, February, March this year, we saw what I like to kind of term as an explosion. There's a further 165% increase, and the worrying thing was that it really drove above the 3 million sample mark, which really did mean that we needed to look deeper into what is going on here, and why is this becoming ever so popular. So to do this, I think what might be useful here is if we give a level set for everybody on the call, to kind of go into the history and really how ransomware in itself has developed, and some of the worrying trends, and some of the things that we're seeing at the moment. Now, the history and the evolution, the actual thing is that the fact that ransomware is decades old. But it has had a resurgence among hackers, and really generally because of its ease of use, its profitability, its recent confluence with cryptography, and its devious effectiveness. It's a very effective bit of ransomware. Now, those of you that have been around for a while will remember, and those that have looked into the history books will kind of look at where this came from. You know, there's a chap called Joseph Propp who was a Harvard trained biologist, I think. Now he physically mailed out floppy disks that said they were going to contain new information about the AIDS virus to all the attendees of a World Health Organization conference. Now, instead of the program on the disk, it had encrypted the data of the computers and then demanded a payment by mail to a PO box in Panama. Now, there was a hell of a lot of effort needed to conduct this campaign, and you know, it really was a small target audience. But what we then saw was the fact that ransomware was made more easy to distribute with the increased connectivity. What we saw then was mass spamming of a single unique sample, which made it easier to distribute. But although the end game was annoying, it was very simplistic in its execution and was generally easy to spot in badly spelt or worded or, you know, crappy emails. But now what we see is a real evolution. We've seen that cyber criminals have shifted their focus from showing how technically skilled they are to really just trying to maximize profits. You know, this is now organized crime, but this is now run along business principles. And this is a worrying kind of trend that we're starting to see. The crypto element of this, the ransomware, is both effective and actually very easy for hackers to control. Now, it doesn't take complex skills or super specialized knowledge to deploy, but you can buy it just like you'd buy Microsoft Office or one of the latest apps like Candy Crush. And over the past year, we've seen even more worrying trends, which are, you know, things like affiliate schemes. So, you know, what are we seeing, and how are we seeing it? Well, we're seeing a change from the lone attacker, again, trying to show how technically gifted he is, or we're also seeing a move away from those motivated by a cause, by you know, a real kind of raison d'etre. What we're starting to see now, and the real worrying thing for us, is we're starting to see a real advance in this criminal element, which is that these are starting to be run exactly like businesses. Now, whenever I say they're run like businesses, I usually get a bit of a giggle in the room. But some of the things, when we've looked into these samples, we've started to see that ransomware is astonishingly profitable. So a single instance, for example, of a Cryptolocker ransomware made over $250,000 in 1 month. And the crypto wall resulted in a total of $1 million of paid out ransoms. Now, admittedly, the people that pay out these ransoms, it's only a small percentage. But the fact is that the sense of that many people, and we see that many unique samples, that still this is a relatively profitable enterprise. And as opposed to physical crime, robbing a bank or mugging an old lady, the risk of getting caught is actually negligible. So what I want to kind of show you is some insights of what we're actually seeing when we investigate these criminal networks. And what we're starting to see is an organized network of experts all playing their part to be part of this crimeware wave. We're seeing hacking or malware as a service becoming rife, and you know, really, you brief in your product requirements to your engineering department. In effect, you tell them who your target is, and you know how you'd like the malware to be delivered, to enter, to mimic some of their business procedures, and the engineering will be done for you to allow you to target that specific target effectively. We're seeing a rise in marketing. So these people are not just technical experts, they're becoming more marketing savvy. So we're seeing the design and translation of phishing emails. You know, that there are people that will look into the use of grammar within their emails, and we're seeing research into, if they attack a specific business, we're seeing research into obtaining general business emails from that business so they can mimic the tone of voice, the words used, and the phraseology that's generally adhered to within that business. So these are clever. We also see that botnets are being recruited to transmit messages. So what happens is in the affiliate networks, just like the Asda or Argos will generally use things like Groupon to promote a special offer or a special voucher code. We find that we're seeing that botnets are actually distributing some of the malware on behalf of criminals, and they're simply charging a commission. And we're seeing that between $10,000 and $18,000 per month can be earned simply by distributing the malware that you did not create. And finally, one of my favorites, where we were looking into the crypto malware, and with some of the ransoms that are being paid by Bitcoin, some of the companies that have been targeted are actually finding it hard, even if they wanted to pay the ransom, to transfer their money from dollars to Bitcoin, from euros to Bitcoin. So there's a worrying trend where they actually offer you customer service. So you can chat online to your attacker, who will maybe temporarily lift your encryption, so you can maybe pay it, or they'll walk you through how to transfer your money from dollars to Bitcoin in a very, very good customer service chat. So these are the kind of things that we need to tell you guys about, that it's not just the odd baddie working in isolation. This is really a worrying business that's very, very profitable, has got low risk of being caught, and is actually being run very, very well. So some other little information that we that we'll kind of give to you. I mean, it's probably a no-brainer that we see most of these the real Cryptolocker victims being in North America and Europe. In effect, people are only going to target people with the means to pay the ransom, or with data that they hold with such value that they care about the data enough to pay a ransom. So, this might be an obvious thing, but this is really a North American, Europe, and small elements of Asian problem. Now, I've got some quick updates from the field, some real stories of ransomware, just to try and make it a little bit more real to you guys. Now, we've seen there's three kind of recent stories that we've come across, both with companies contacting us, generally because their antivirus hasn't stood up to the test of these advanced attacks. We had a European financial services institution contact us, and the thing is that they were impeded from trading for 6 hours during peak business time. Now, one of the stories behind this was that emails were received. Phishing is generally the entry point, along with spear phishing, really targeted, and also drive-by downloads. But they were targeted by emails, spear phishing. The emails were received at the local branch offices with content really related to the bank's day-to-day processes. So it was a really clever mimic of, we're changing our business processes, click here to find out what the new business process is. Now, these emails contained a Microsoft Word document as an attachment with an embedded macro, and the macro downloaded malicious content from remote servers. Now, very quickly, between 600 and 1,000 offices were known to have opened the document, and the downloaded malware encrypted all locatable Microsoft, so Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., and most importantly, text files on local and remote systems. So a number of the impacted text files, which was interesting, were actually used to initiate the business critical banking applications. So businesses stopped. And as a reaction, the bank also stopped all email to actually prevent further potential spreading of the malware. Now, this is just an example of how a small thing that maybe holds you to ransom for $500 can actually impact a business and take it down for that length in time. You know, some other the really other thing that I'd like to point out is that when people look at this, they generally say, you know, I won't be attacked. I'm not that important. I'm only small. No one's going to be bothered with me. Well, we've seen, again, some worrying elements, not to overdo the worry, but the worrying elements to target small businesses, and especially kind of law firms. We've seen multiple crypto campaigns launched against UK law firms and other small companies. Now, many of these companies use collaborative file shares rather than document management systems to work on court documents or record client communication and collect evidence, that kind of thing. Now, in two cases known to us, law firms had their entire SAN encrypted, and because the backup systems weren't adequate, the malware didn't just put the documents out of reach, it nearly put the companies out of business. Simply because court submissions, missed deadlines, important client documents were unavailable. And I think that monetarily, you know, this pales into insignificance due to reputational damage, and that needs to be kind of taken into account when we look at this. That the court cases were actually jeopardized due to a malware infection. And we used to give advice saying, you know, backups are really key to kind of defending against this. But we've even seen a recent uptick in the amount of latent ransomware that's dropped onto client systems that will hold sleep for a week, 2 weeks, because they will understand how often the targeted company will back up their systems, and it'll sit there and it'll wait until 2 backup cycles have gone, and then even rolling back through the backup, you're still kind of keep infected. So I think that what we're looking towards now, and to kind of to get back upbeat and to give you a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, I think that what we're seeing is that we need a solution to the problem, and simply relying on a vendor marching into your offices to sell you the next silver bullet solution or the next amount of magic beans. This is one example that the magic beans, you know, don't work. The silver bullets doesn't work. You know, what we're seeing here is this is one example that takes a real advanced system and more advanced thinking to really combat the advanced threats. Now, just to kind of, if I leave you with one thing, that, you know, I hear reports that antivirus is dead, endpoint is dead. Well, it's not. It's a very useful tool and needs to be, core to your malware defense. However, when we're looking at advanced malware, we're seeing that whatever antivirus you have, this is really only going to give you kind of up to 63% kind of protection against this. And Marcus will go into why later on. And as part of this series of webinars, we're going to give you a demo on you know, how to get better at this. But really, we need to kind of change the way we think about defending against malware. We need a lot of sharing of context, of information, of reputation, and some more handy kind of cool technology. Our technology needs to support what we try and do as a business and the way that malware is going. We need to move to 99.96%. You're never ever going to have 100% protection. Try as we might, and as good as we are, you're never going to happen. But what we need to do is make it so difficult for the criminals to kind of get access to you, and to make their money. We need to make their lives so difficult that it deters them. So I think that now I've gone over and over and kind of done the Dow a bit. I'm going to hand over to Marcus Wirtel, our enterprise technology specialist, who will talk to you about how to combat ransomware from a technology point of view, and through employing things like our advanced threat defense and also our threat intelligence exchange. So, Marcus.
Thank you, Mark.
Super.
Just need to get the presentation right, please. Pass me the ball. Okay, no. I still can't show my screen, Mark. No, now I can. No.
Thanks, Marcus.
Okay. Does it work? Can you see me? Okay. Right. So, yeah, thank you. And I'll pick up the baton here directly from Mark. My name is Marcus Wirtel. I am working specifically in the field of network security and advanced threats, which ties into many of the problem areas outlined here. I'd like to pretty much pick up right away on this whole statement with regards to the efficacy of antiviruses, and why they're only roughly at 63 plus minus 5% probably against samples like this. And some of you may be thinking, well, you know of another antivirus vendor that claims to be working better, or maybe in your own experience appears to be working better at this. But we need to differentiate between what an antivirus does, which is by and large a system based on blacklisting, and combination of a number of different techniques, including the use of whitelisting on endpoints, including the capability of using host IPS for behavioral detection. But even with these sort of extra measures that go beyond what normally an antivirus would do, you may find yourself faced with insurmountable odds with regards to some of these samples and the polymorphic nature and some of the evasive capabilities that are built into malware that we've termed now cryptomalware, as opposed to ransomware. Ransomware, we didn't mention that earlier on, but ransomware would be your typical police Trojan that just scares you into paying, even though not much has happened to your system. But with cryptomalware, you actually have a lasting and in some instances irrevocable impact onto the actual system. So just to step through some of the phases here that apply to pretty much all forms of cryptomalware. First of all, you have some form of delivery, and this Marcus has already touched on. This might be through an established botnet. For example, previously, when we looked at the first phase of proliferation of this type of malware, a lot was delivered through the Game Over Zeus botnet until that was taken down, which might also account for the lowering in detections that we've seen, until we now have multiple campaigns running in parallel, from the original Cryptolocker and its evolution to other variants like the CryptoWall and some of the other ones. So the variants target different types of audiences. Some are more business focused, some of them are more consumer focused. So Tesla Crypt, for example, would be going after let's say online gamers to try and lock down their respective important information, which tends to be save games and access to online gaming accounts, to force them to pay. This might be less relevant to you unless, of course, it involves any of your children, perhaps, that are going to assume that you keep them safe, considering that you may or may not consider yourself to be a security professional or security-aware professional. And I trust you me, I have had my share of run-ins with my own children with regards to trying to keep them safe, and all their Minecraft accounts and all their Minecraft modding activities. So it's not like this doesn't impact us, even if it's focused on the more consumer side of things. But staying with the business, we have a delivery through a number of different mechanisms. We have an exploit that is carried out, usually using either widespread, widely available vulnerabilities that may be in your browsers, maybe in plugins within your browsers. There may be Java specific, where there are numerous vulnerabilities, and Oracle is in a Sisyphus task of trying to stem the tide of the vulnerabilities that are built into Java, and the list goes on. But once the exploit is carried out, the first thing many of these variants actually will do is one command and control call back to a central management server, which may or may not be hidden, for a public key. The whole principle of cryptographic malware resides on the fact that as asynchronous or asymmetric encryption involves a key pair of a public and a private key. So anything that's encrypted with the public key can only be decrypted with the private key. Anything that's been, let's say, signed is typically the term used here, with the private key can only be unpacked with the public key. So what's needed here to actually achieve the aims is, of course, to encrypt the documents with a specific public key that may be specific to the particular victim. So therefore, a command and control call will be needed. And the private key for this key pair will be withheld. And that's exactly how the whole thing works. Now, you cannot switch into live mode until the encryption has taken place. And this may vary from victim to victim, how many objects or documents will be encrypted. So in the very first phase here now, we will have the malware being active. The exploit has taken place. We may even have had some command and control communication, but now the malware will be busy enumerating your system, finding out what it can reach, and that may be your local drives, or it may be connected drives, like in the examples that we saw before with the law companies, or also the example that we had with the health service provider, where the initial infections may have been just on some administrative PCs, but subsequently spread via Windows file sharing due to file shares that the malware had access to, or could subsequently encrypt any documents that were reachable. In the process of enumerating these documents, it also leaves certain indicators that we may be able to pick up, and that I will come back to later on. Now, once it has finished its enumeration and has achieved its target of encrypting everything, and Mark mentioned earlier on that some variants now actually tend to sleep for a while. That means it actually stays in this pre-lock mode for an extended period. It actually is active on your system. It is providing the decryption on the fly for documents where it hasn't gone into full lock mode. But once the actual lockdown occurs, at that moment, your system switches into the ransom mode. You get the typical splash screens that will inform you how you can pay, how much time you have left, and in the case of Mark outlined, maybe even some customer support, how to get your Bitcoin currencies. And from this moment in time, you typically have no way to reverse this. The only way how it might be reversed has been in some instances where law enforcement has been able to seize command and control servers and has been able to extract the private keys from them or from other parts of the control infrastructure, but that's not always the case. And we have had instances of the victims complaining to the law enforcement agencies because they took the command and control servers down, ruining any chance for them to ever get their files back, because if there was no backups, if there was no other means to get those respective files, then the only chance they would have had is to actually get the private key from the perpetrators, from the malware actors. And in most instances, if you do get the private keys, be that now from law enforcement, if you're lucky, or from the actual actors, you probably will be able to reverse the state of the system. That is because this is being operated as a business, as Mark outlined. The intent is to achieve as many people paying up as possible. So if word gets out that they ultimately will not get the keys back, that might discourage victims to actually pay up, which is of course contrary to the business objectives of what they're trying to achieve. Now, in terms of defending against something like this, we need to look at this in the terms of standard incident response. That means we naturally enough need to first detect the actual attack in progress. If we cannot detect it, then we will only detect it when we are moved into this lock phase, and by then the damage is done. If we do detect it, then it's a race against the clock in terms of containing this attack. That is to either limit the damage or ideally be able to try and stop any of the encryption activity taking place in the first place. And then lastly, of course, the response or remediation phase is targeted at trying to reverse any of the damage that's been done insofar that it's possible. Now, focusing on the detection here now first. As we said earlier at the beginning, a conventional antivirus, not utilizing any other techniques, so basically it is based on some heuristics and otherwise only on signatures of known malware, will probably only pick up roughly around 65% of these new forms of crypto malware. Now, it still covers 65%, and extended next generation analysis engines are resource hungry and typically cannot be applied to every sample, every object that's entering your organization. Therefore, it does make sense to use known and established down selectors, as we call them, or you may call them as pre-filtering engines, to reduce the number of samples that may need to be analyzed in more advanced engines. So that includes obviously picking up anything that we know to be malicious, known blacklisting, or samples that we know to be 100% secure or safe, so-called global whitelisting, which again reduces the number of samples we need to deal with. Adding to this, you add what we call GTI, the Global Threat Intelligence, or you could abstract this as generally as cloud intelligence, in terms of known active campaigns, perhaps with a lifetime of a couple of hours or days, that may not be on any of the static white and blacklisting filters, but can be carried or can be caught using a query in a couple of milliseconds against these global threat intelligence repositories. And then lastly, the antivirus engines will be able to pick up pretty much most known and some of the lesser known variants. So that reduces the number of samples we need to deal with. Beyond that, the next step is to move into real-time emulation. And in this type of engine, in our case, it's the gateway anti-malware, which is present in products like our web gateway, where it came from in the first place, as well as our IPS and in our advanced threat defense, which we'll talk about in a moment. An engine like this is particularly well suited to deal with malware that is script-based or has a very strong script element, be that Visual Basic, be that macros, be that .NET, be that JavaScript or Java. And in a context like this, it would typically have something like a 95% catch rate, even against unknown malware samples that we haven't seen before. It has probably some challenges when we talk about multiple layers of different types of compression, PE files in particular. And in this scenario, we have no other choice but to resort to what is generally known as sandboxing, or which we would here more technically call dynamic and static code analysis. Dynamic analysis is classic sandboxing. That means we're talking about the spinning up of a virtual machine, which gets exposed to a particular sample, and we observe what is happening within that virtual machine, which allows us to, in some instances, determine the malicious behavior, and allows us also to extract so-called indicators of compromise or indicators of attack, which can then be used to perhaps go hunting for the malware that might have already infiltrated our infrastructure. I will come back to that later. The other element is static code analysis, which is incredibly important in view of malware that we may not be able to get to execute in the VM. And increasingly advanced malware has built-in evasive capabilities that will let it shoot right past any of the sandbox vendors, including our own if we were just relying on this. The sort of information, like in this case from Cryptolocker, that you may see from a dynamic analysis or sandboxing would be something like this. So some indicators may be suspicious, but on their own not enough to necessarily convict a sample, but there may be other ones with regards to manipulating application names, or in particular forking methods that are used for creating persistence on the system. They can be classified as malicious and help us subsequently out of a range of different criteria, from spreading behavior to command and control activity to shellcode or exploit activity, to derive a scoring that allows us to classify the behavior of that particular sample. There are a number of engines that are involved in the conviction. As I mentioned before, the file reputation in terms of the GTI, the Global Threat Intelligence, as well as the gateway anti-malware and the antivirus are certainly part of this. There will be the dynamic analysis. I will talk about the static code analysis in a moment, but also there's the capability in some instances where your organization has its own intelligence with regards to indicators or behaviors that you want to look for, that you can load custom Yara rules, they're called, into the platform to enhance the detection capability. Now, as I mentioned before, sometimes dynamic analysis may not work because you have evasive tricks like delayed execution. Typically, a VM will only run somewhere between 1 to 3 minutes, or you may have detection of artifacts within the sandbox, which pretty much tell the malware that it's not on a user system, but actually in an analysis environment. Or it might be tricks that are geared towards detecting the presence of a user, which of course, again, wouldn't be the case in an automated analysis environment like a sandbox. If we only relied on dynamic analysis alone, it would be still way too easy to bypass this. Therefore, we combine dynamic analysis with static code analysis. Now, this is not static analysis in the sense of just looking at the PE header of a file, but to actually completely unpack numerous layers of proprietary compression even, as well as disassembly of the entire code that allows us to actually parse not the file in its compressed form, but the completely uncompressed, normalized code that may have gotten rid of some code obfuscation, as well as bypassing any built-in evasive capabilities in the dynamic analysis, because we're not trying to execute the code here. We're actually looking at the unexecuted or just before execution stage of the code. That allows us to do something that, especially with regards to the trends we've seen with malware, is unique and allows us to detect even malware that is completely net new, so-called 0 days, is only targeted at a single victim, a completely targeted sample, and is using evasive capabilities that would otherwise render conventional detection mechanisms mute. So malware is not developed in a vacuum. Ultimately, malware writers, the software developers, are following very similar guidelines and processes as any other software developer. That means malware tends to be modular. And in this modular approach, you don't tend to write stuff from scratch each and every time. So when you have a campaign, let's say like CryptoWall, for example, you might have in your earlier instances, you might have openly accessible command control servers that can be traced back. You might have a payment mechanism that used something like Western Union or Ucash or so, which might be, it's not bad, but it's not as safe from a security or OPSEC perspective in terms of avoiding any tracing back of the payments. And the vulnerabilities that you may have targeted and the exploits you have used might have received widespread patching, so your first generation of the malware may no longer be as effective as it was. Well, what do? You move on to version 2, and you move on to version 3. And we've seen that exactly with CryptoWall, for example, where any of the scenarios I just touched on have been replaced by better, more advanced techniques. So the command and control servers are no longer out in the open, so to say, on the web, but they're actually using hidden services within Tor networks. So we're talking about encrypted traffic, which is extremely difficult to trace back. We are talking about payment mechanisms that are using cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and various other changes that made that malware a lot more resilient, a lot more successful, but it's still an evolution of a previous version. And you get frameworks like many of the ones that I've outlined here that help you as a malware writer to do these evolutions without having to rewrite everything from scratch. In fact, as Mark mentioned early on, you may have the whole thing supplied to you as a service where you're pretty much providing, I don't know, perhaps you're just operating the actual campaign. You may take the operational security risk, but all the scripting, all the packaging, and all the development is being taken care of by other individuals or other organizations that by disassociating themselves with that campaign, also disassociate themselves with the criminal liability in this case. Now, from a technical detection perspective, that offers us an opportunity, because if we can reverse engineer the code to such an extent that we can do code comparison between previous versions of a malware family and subsequent new variants that may surface, we can do something that is called family classification. I have a concrete sample here for you from the previous Cryptolocker variant, and it's initialization of the Mersenne twister algorithm, which is a pseudo-random number generator that's used in part of the CNC and cryptographic activity. The same particular routine is common across a lot of cryptomalware samples, like, for example, the Z-bot that I'm listing below. And I've been told by our labs that even with the current versions of CryptoWall version 3 and TeslaCrypt, we still see many of these particular initialization routines in the actual code base itself. They're not detectable from outside due to the packing and the encoding and obfuscation of the actual code base, but once reverse engineered, we can derive a similarity factor to the previous prototypes of this type of malware. Like in this case, for example, 71%. Or it might in some instances even be a 100% match, because we found a 100% match of a specific routine that we know is only used in specific malware campaigns, and therefore we can convict malware using the advanced threat defense platform here without having had any previous indication of a previous attack, without having been able to execute the malware in any shape or form, and without having any other knowledge of that malware prior to its surfacing in the sandbox for the first time. This is really the factor that brings our detection rate, as Mark mentioned before, from 93% to something in the high 9s. It will never be 100%. It will remain an arms race, and it ultimately boils down to a mixture of how you're deploying the rest of your infrastructure and especially your countermeasure capability, because detection alone will not help you. You need to be able, ideally in an automated form, to actually do something about it when that detection occurs. Therefore, we have architected our advanced threat defense platform to work in conjunction with any of the other elements that we have on offer. That means email gateways, next generation firewalls, web gateways, IPSs, and our endpoint agent as well. And especially our endpoint agent integration into ATD has a unique capability to enhance your protective posture, because we're not talking about trying to block stuff only at the gateway. We are combining network and endpoint specific anti-malware capabilities, so that, for example, when you have intrusion vectors that are coming from removable media, from direct intrusions into wireless networks, for example, from infected laptops that have been carried into the organization by contractors or due to BOYD policies. The combination of gateway as well as endpoint-centric anti-malware capabilities gives you the greatest amount of coverage that is possible. The only other element that's critical here now is to be able to let these elements work in conjunction cooperatively, as well as the ability to effect countermeasures in response to detections. Just generating another alert to send it up to your log management or theme system will not help you in these instances. By the time you have worked out as to whether that is a valid threat, and you've made the necessary phone calls to other departments, etc., by then the malware has not only been active, it probably has finished its encryption activities, and you're already in lockdown mode, by which time any countermeasures are pretty much pointless. You need to be able to effect these countermeasures ideally from a single console and in response to the detections as quickly as possible. Now, for the scenarios where these countermeasures were not quick enough, and we have many scenarios where detections may occur, detections that we know are in the infrastructure we have, there are already indicators of compromise. That may be specific file hashes of a new polymorphic variant at this moment in time by that malware, and are not going to be valid an hour from now because they use things like fastblocks or other domain name algorithms to switch the command and control method of operation. But you can extract this information in near real time from the sandbox and then use that information to actually go hunting for the malware in your infrastructure. Now, before we go on to the hunting, let me outline how you can achieve inoculation, vaccination of the infrastructure by utilizing the integration between, for example, an endpoint working in conjunction with ATD and the threat intelligence exchange server. You need a repository to be able to store indicators of compromise. And that's exactly what the threat intelligence exchange server here achieves. So we have a scenario where we have an endpoint that is faced with a new file that it hasn't seen before and needs to establish if this file is malicious or not. It will first query the TIE server for information on previous detection or previous information about that file. That is a local repository. It will in turn query, as you may see up here, the global threat intelligence as well. But you may be part of a targeted campaign, for example, like what we've seen with the UK law companies, and therefore going out to the cloud may not give you any additional information, but it might have been seen elsewhere in your local infrastructure before. So the first check is against the local repository. If there is no information about it, it can move on to submit that particular object directly to the sandbox, in this case the ATD appliance, to analyze this particular file and extract information as well as conviction from the dynamic as well as the static analysis processes. This information is sent back to the requesting endpoint, but it is also cascaded into the TIE server so that this information is now pretty much turned into organizational or local intelligence. From there, it can inform any other elements of your infrastructure, be that your firewalls, your IPS, your web gateway, your email gateway, or it can also feed that information up to the ESM, to the SIM system, where it can be used for extended correlation and analysis in case there is other indicators that this has happened before or that previous recon attempts have been carried out against the organization. This step effectively creates a vaccination or inoculation of not just the one endpoint that saw the file or the sample in the first instance, but any of the endpoints around it. And this stops the spread in the first instance and stops subsequent downloads of the same objects from any other sources in case you're talking about or you're faced with a multi-vector delivery. Beyond that, using the indicators of compromise that we may have been able to draw out of the sandbox environment, we can actually go and start hunting for these indicators in your infrastructure. Intel Security will be launching later this year. We're currently in a tech preview for this product, McAfee Active Response. McAfee Active Response allows us to go hunting for malware and set traps for malware campaigns that we may be expecting. That may be, for example, in the case of Cryptomalware, the existence of certain registry keys or files where we know that malware is storing information about the files that it's encrypting. The malware needs to keep an index of the files that it has encrypted if it wants to be able to decrypt them at a later stage. That's a typical indicator of compromise that we can go searching for. Alternatively, even just searching for a hash value, not a file name, but a specific hash value of a file that might be specific to a phase in polymorphic malware or variation that we're faced with right now, to be able to scan your entire infrastructure for any presence of any files that match a specific hash value is incredibly valuable. Typically, in normal incident response, this task can take you days, provided you have enough staff available, and by the time you're finished, you might as well start again because the status quo has entirely changed again. Lastly, certain activity like, for example, some of these initialization routines that I mentioned before, if you're expecting, or you know, because there is a current campaign ongoing against, let's say, law companies, as we mentioned before, or health companies, or insurance companies, you may set certain triggers on your endpoints that cause very little impact on the actual CPU utilization on the endpoint, but allow you to either initiate automated blocking activity in response to certain indicators of compromise, or some customers are telling us they actually do not want to be doing any blocking anymore because they know the moment they start blocking the malware, the attack may shift to another phase, which means that from an incident response perspective, they're starting over and need to start the whole cycle at ground zero again. So they prefer, instead of blocking, they want to switch into a mode of increased forensic evidence gathering, which allows them to achieve better attribution of where this attack is coming from and gather more intelligence to beef out their infrastructure. And lastly, to be able to perhaps guide that attack towards honeypots or other elements in your infrastructure where the attacker can exhaust their activities without achieving anything and ultimately let them run out of steam. Mark mentioned this early on, that the objective wouldn't be necessarily just to foil everything, but to actually make the process of attacking you so expensive that the attack either stops or they shift to another victim. Might not sound very social, but the reality is that attackers will go for the weakest links. And if you make your infrastructure strong enough that it is not worth the effort, economies of attack is something that attackers do need to consider and will consider. So the best defense that you could have is to make your infrastructure resilient enough that attacks at least move elsewhere. And that brings me pretty much to the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, I'm going to have a look here at the question and answer panel. So feel welcome to put any questions to me there. If I can expand this Lumen thing so I can see it. Yeah. Okay, I had some indications that some people had difficulty seeing the presentation. Okay. All right. If there's no other questions, then I think we can probably close. Thank you very much for your time. Oh, hang on. I think there's one question coming in. Okay, there's one question on what custom Yara is. No, it's not custom hash files. Yara rules are a way, and this is not something that is proprietary to Intel Security, so you can just Google for this. Yara rules are a way of describing behavior. So, for example, these initializations of certain routines or API calls can be scripted in Yara, and you can create your own custom Yara rules to upload them into the detection sandbox. So if you feel that what we're providing out of the box is not sufficient, you can actually enhance the detection capability yourself. Now, one question with regards to variants of Cryptolocker, with regards to the latest VirusScan Enterprise DAT files. Do bear in mind that the release of that, and by the way, I'm not an expert on endpoint security, but I can tell you that DAT files, in the time it takes to create new DAT files, we're talking typically at least several hours until you have a new DAT file released that covers a new variant. In the meantime of that particular development cycle, and it is about as optimized as that blacklisting approach can be optimized. you will have numerous infections. If you look at the latest data from the Verizon data breach report, they have stated, I think it came out in probably March or April this year, they have stated that 70 to 90% of all samples are now unique to an organization. That means if you're the only victim of a particular variant, no DAT file is going to be able to protect you against that type of attack. And that includes DAT files or signatures from any other antivirus vendors as well. You can use advanced or enhanced protection capability on endpoints like whitelisting or enhanced behavioral detections through host IPS. That is true, but you need to consider that some of these approaches don't work for all systems. And you may also consider that not every system will have these enhanced detection capability or protection capabilities on the system. So again, it goes back to what I said before of mixing enhanced endpoint protection as well as enhanced anti-malware protection in the network to achieve maximum security posture. And yes, exactly. You can block encryption activity on the endpoint to some extent. Bear in mind that encryption activity may be legitimate. From a network perspective, for example, the typical problem for me as a network security specialist is that network-based encryption activity, for example, on a file share, does not look any different than file and folder encryption, which you may be employing legitimately because, let's say, you want to keep files that are used by your HR department secured from other members in your organization. So just blocking encryption activity per se may be something that is more difficult. And yes, we have seen examples of Cryptolocker where the access have run from other areas than specific directories. You can set certain HIPS rules as well as other detection mechanisms to stop these executions, but bear in mind some customers are telling us they actually don't want to stop the execution. They want to switch into advanced detection during those times so they can achieve higher grades of attribution. And that means, for example, with regards to the active response, what you can do there is switch the endpoint into additional flow collection. So we have a module there that's called host flow. Think of NetFlow, but it's running on the endpoint. And it would allow you just in response to certain IOCs, indicators of compromise that you may have detected, to switch the endpoint into collecting enhanced PCAP data, which at a later stage you can use for forensic to actually figure out, let's say, if the endpoint at the time was not in the infrastructure, they were in Starbucks or they were somewhere in a hotel room on a VPN connection or so, and were not necessarily within your NetFlow domain, you still have flow data that can be collected so you can figure out at the time of the attack exactly what took place. And with regards to the question on additional HIPS rules, there are some best practice documents that we have recently released with regards to Cryptomalware. In fact, we might, as Mark mentioned, we're going to do a series of these webcasts. I might include them in the next webcast, or certainly we make them available by that time. I don't have them at hand here right now, but you can certainly dig them out and make them available to you as a best practice with regards to how to sharpen HIPS protections against Cryptomalware. That's no problem. And I think we probably have all the questions now. At this stage, I probably have to close this. I thank you very much for your attention and wish you all a good day. And I hope it's not as hot where you are as it is here for me in Germany right now. It's certainly a heat wave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Intel Security, and thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. We hope you found the webinar insightful, and I'm sure many of you will have further questions to ask. So please feel free to give us a call on 01628 418 000 or email us at McAfee@axial.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you and we'll be delighted to help. Finally, you can find out more about us and what we can do for you at www.axial.co.uk. You can also register for the next webinar via the link on the screen now. Thank you and see you next month.